Hello everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you get top grades in the subject. So in today's video, we are going to be looking at another top grade sample essay walkthrough on Romeo and Juliet. And I'll be using the AQA 2020 November past paper for this. So let's dive straight in. So in this question, we're given the extract from Act 1, Scene 1 of Romeo and Juliet, and then asked to answer the question that follows. So at this point in the play, the prince has arrived to stop the fight that has broken out in the center of Verona. So Prince Escalus, he is the governor, right, of Verona here in this play. And so starting with this conversation that you see on the screen, explore how Shakespeare presents the effects of the conflict between the Capulet and Montague families. Right. So this is a good extract to work with because it's just one speech, right, by the prince. And so it's very concentrated and there's not a lot of distractions, right, unlike with some of the extracts when you have multiple characters talking. So this is a nice extract to work with, yeah? So we're asked to write about how Shakespeare presents the effects of the conflict between the families in this extract, right, as filtered through the prince's speech, and how Shakespeare presents the effects of the conflict between the Capulet and Montague families in the play as a whole. So this is a good topic to think about because it's also a quite niche, right? Because usually when people think of Romeo and Juliet, there's a lot of character-centric sort of analysis that would dominate everyone's focus, not least Romeo and Juliet's relationship with one another, which actually happens to be the 2019 May top grade essay walkthrough that I've done. So if you haven't checked out that already, I'd encourage you to watch that video as well. Link in the description below or here. So let's dive straight into this question, right? This prince's speech and how the conflict between the two families are reflected. So intro paragraph. This extract is taken from Act 1, Scene 1, at the point when the brawl between the servants of the Capulet and Montague families is broken up, which actually alludes to Samson and Gregory and Abraham's brawl, right? But right before this speech, which actually occasioned this speech. In the prince's speech, Shakespeare establishes a key thematic idea, and that's conflict begets conflict, right? And conflict generates more conflict and so on and so forth. From the age-old feud between the Capulet and Montague families stems a series of violent, tragic events, which is reflected in the motif of violence that overarches this extract. Conflict has the potential to fan men's baser primal instincts, leading them to behave in beastly ways by hurting or killing each other. So the student picks out a central technique that she'll be using to anchor her analysis throughout the rest of the essay, which is the motif of violence, right? Both in terms of the physical violence that has actually happened right before the scene, but also the emotional violence that we will be seeing in much of the play, right, as we go on to read it. And so if unrestrained and unresolved, interpersonal conflicts will eventually manifest in deaths and tragedies, which is what eventually transpires in the play. In the rest of this essay, I will illustrate how the prince's speech conveys such ideas, as well as examine the impact of the family's feud on the play's characters and their relationships at large. Very clear, right, signposting for us what the student is going to do in the rest of the essay. So let's dive straight into it. First main body paragraph.
By the way, guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel, and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English Lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature.
It's ironic, so really good that the student right away has picked up on the irony in this moment, that the prince, while exhorting the brawlers to stop their violent clash, should deploy the imagery of violence throughout his speech, right? Simply by being privy to the men's altercation, the prince himself is riled up into a hostile state, which suggests the emotionally contagious nature of conflict. So the irony here, in case it isn't already clear, is that the prince is telling the servants to stop being violent, but he himself actually uses a lot of violent words and ideas in his speech, right? and he's actually behaving in a sort of violently inclined way as well. Presumably a man of stately composure, the prince becomes a moved prince. Moved here meaning angry, which is the phrase he himself uses to refer to in this speech, consumed by as much of the anger he is warning the men to curb. At the start of the speech, the prince's distress is shown in the fractured syntax of his accusatory tautological descriptions. Tautology meaning unnecessary repetition, but of course unnecessary in the sense that it is repeated clearly, but for a purpose, of course, not really unnecessary in the context of literary analysis. There's always a point, right? When something is repeated. When he chastises the fighting men as rebellious subjects, enemies to peace, profaners of this neighbour-stained steel. So you notice that all of these three descriptions, they all kind of relate to the same idea, which is, that these men are violent and rowdy, right? The words rebellious, enemies, and profaners cast these conflict-stirring servants as harmful agents counter to the interest of state and church, right? Profaners carrying the connotation of blasphemy, this religious connotation as well, right? So in turn, when the prince animalizes you men as you beasts that quench the fire of your pernicious rage with purple fountains issuing from your veins, the association of fire with rage points to the biblical sin of wrath as a way towards hell. Allusion, right? The student is bringing an allusion here, highlighting that the family's hostility against each other is both a social and moral tumor that poisons the Christian harmony and peace of the state. However, the irony of the prince's desire to maintain peace is sharpened all the more by his brutal graphic threats, right? When he warns that on pain of torture and on pain of death, these violent men will be punished if the conflict continues. Right? So again, irony is that the prince is counseling the servants to behave in a Christian manner, but he himself is very much slipping into an unchristian, ungenerous demeanor, right? Which perhaps speaks to a fundamental paradox about state governance, and that is to ensure peace, it is sometimes necessary to administer violence, right? So the paradox is that in order for there to be peace, there must also be a hearty dose of violence in the governance. So from the prince's vantage as governor of Venice, he sees the Capulet and Montague's long-standing feud as a primary cause of social instability, but more subtly as a dangerous opportunity for men to turn their backs on civilized codes of behavior. Okay, and this is interesting because this opens up a really rich opportunity for the student to explore the greater historical context of Renaissance Venice, actually, right? Which of course is not the immediate geographic environment that Shakespeare is writing in, himself being in England, but the understanding of Renaissance Italy was very much, present in the English cultural consciousness, right? So Renaissance Venice was distinct precisely for its reputation as a bastion of civilization and humanism, which the rest of Europe looked towards as a model to admire and emulate, right? No less, England included. To protect this image, the prince would have been acutely anxious about ensuring the behavioral civility of his men, and this is especially apparent when he remarks that the two families' animosity has made Verona's ancient citizens cast by their grave beseeming ornaments. So his emphasis on the men's act of taking off their seemingly sober, grave beseeming garments, their clothes, is telling, right? Because on the one hand, the beseeming nature of their clothes suggests that men, when stripped down to their basic core, are wild, violent, and beast-like, right? We are animals after all. Which is why there is all the more a need for Venetians to metaphorically wear and hold onto the civilized coverings, right? Ornamental and contrary to human nature as they may be. Right? This idea that the Venetians have this added cultural responsibility to behave as civilized subjects, right? Held up on this pedestal for the rest of Europe to emulate and admire, right? It's part of their sort of branding, right? And so in a similar vein, the line, "cankered with peace to part your cankered hate," a key line in the prince's speech, embodies this dichotomous essence, which is respectively conveyed through the antinacluses and chiastic placement of the two cankered references in this line. So antinacluses and chiasmus, slightly more advanced rhetorical devices here, but you'll also see on the screen here I've presented for you the meaning of these two devices. So don't worry too much if they seem quite alien to you. Just kind of, maybe take it as a point of reference, as, an added sort of sophisticated device that you could add to your arsenal of stylistic devices to be aware of when you analyze, Shakespeare going forward. While the first cankered means rusted from weathering and lack of use, the second implies malignant, bad-tempered, or even corrupted. That the citizens' hands, which here refers to spears, their weapons, are cankered with peace is a reflection of actually good, peaceful governance, right? Hence the lack of use of weapons. So they're rusty, the weapons and the spears are rusty because they haven't been used for such a long time, because there hasn't been a need to, right? Because everything's been so peaceful. But the status quo is now disrupted, right, and threatened by the Capulet and Montague's cankered, rotten relations. So as a leader trying to rein in these unruly dynamics and hold the social fabric together, the prince must suppress these hostile energies and prevent them from spreading further among the Venetian community. So this impulse to contain and control hostile counterforces then is also reflected in the bookending positioning of the two cankered references. So here it might be a little bit abstract, the idea here, but just to unpack it, it's thinking about how the prince's desire to hold everything together is somewhat sort of visually and syntactically mirrored in the cankered with peace and to part with your cankered hate, the sort of book-ending positioning of these two words, right? Sort of holding these lines, containing these lines within this bookend. So, seeing the mapping of the syntactical positioning with the prince's, impulse here. There's a really imaginative and creative reading, right, of the line, imaginative close reading, in fact, of the line. Okay, and so having actually analysed so much of the speech now, the student then moves on, zooms out to look at the play as a whole and how the Capulet and Montague's hostility and their relationship plays out. So throughout the play, Shakespeare continually reinforces the cyclical and contagious nature of conflict, right? So the student is basically saying, in this play, conflict, specifically that between the two families, is both cyclical and contagious, right? And these are the two key traits of conflict as we see in the play. A key instance is Tybalt and Romeo's mutual animus, which results first in the sacrifice of Romeo's friend, Mercutio, when three characters fight in another street brawl in Act 3, Scene 1. So this sets off Romeo's desire for and pursuit of vengeance against Tybalt, ultimately leading to his arch nemesis death, his own banishment from Verona, and therefore his separation from Juliet, which sets in motion, right, that spiral of tragedy ultimately leading to the carnage. Indeed, when Mercutio dies from Tybalt's fatal stab, he points out that the ultimate cause of his death has not so much to do with the hatred between the warring men present in the scene, but to the unresolved plague on both the Capulet and Montague's houses, right? This the plague of the family's feud. The metaphor of plague that Mercutio uses is apt, as the family's conflict is similar to a destructive epidemic, infecting and damaging relationships from one generation to the next ad infinitum, right? On and on and on and on and on. That Lady Montague should eventually die from grief of her son's exile, right? This quotation taken from the final act. It's tragically ironic too, as by being complicit in the intra-family feud, she is part of the reason for Romeo's banishment, and by extension, she causes her own grief-stricken death as well, right? So the student here actually is quite sensitive to even just like some minor details, because in the final act, actually, Lord Montague tells everyone, well, my wife has actually died from just being so upset over Romeo's exile, right? And that's another manifestation of how the family's feud really destroys relationships, right? And causes, unfortunate deaths. And so finally, with the conclusion, Romeo and Juliet's death-marked love brings their family's conflict to an end. As with their death bury their parents' strife, a phrase taken from the prologue, which perhaps mirrors an early idea mentioned in relation to the prince's dilemma about statecraft and governance, right? Relating it back to the earlier insight that the student makes about the extract, which is that in the realm of human relationships, it is also sometimes necessary that one first resorts to violence in order to create conditions of peace, right? The violence of Romeo and Juliet's death finally creating the conditions of peace between their families. Indeed, by having Romeo and Juliet's violent end herald the start of the family's renewed goodwill, Shakespeare crystallizes this idea in elegant dramatic symmetry. And the symmetry here is between the prince's understanding of how governance necessitates a certain degree of violence, right, punishment, before there can be, peace, social peace on the whole maintained, and then also, mirroring that, parallel that to Romeo and Juliet's death, bringing about their family's final peace. Okay, so that's the sort of symmetry there we see in the play. All right, so as always, I hope this essay walkthrough was helpful for your understanding of what a top grade Romeo and Juliet essay would look like. And if you found this helpful in any way, please do hit the thumbs up button below so that you can encourage me to keep making these useful English Lit Study videos, and subscribe if you haven't already so that you don't miss out on any of my weekly lit videos down the line. And if you haven't already checked out some of my other Romeo and Juliet analysis videos, go ahead and check that out in the description box below, where I will be linking you to the playlist with all of the relevant videos. Okay, and I will see you guys in the next one as always.